I'm back.
Yes. Okay. So we'll be starting now. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the AFBE Leadership Talk Program. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. We are part of the AFBE leadership team, and we have been hosting this leadership series for the past 2 years. If you want to know more about AFBE, please visit the chat group. The website is there, and also the website for our YouTube channels is also there. So please feel free to visit, feel free to ask questions and post it in the chat group. And my colleague Bumi and co-host Bumi will pick up on these questions. Thank you, everyone. So let's jump right into it. Today we have a very special guest. I say very special because it's very dear to me, because I have a story to tell, but I'll tell it later on. But nonetheless, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Christopher Jackson, who is currently the Director of Sustainable Geosciences at Jacobs. He is a visiting professor in basin analysis at Imperial College in London. He's an accomplished scientist with multiple awards, very accustomed to the media limelight, with multiple podcasts, talks, documentary shows on BBC, and of course, the first Black person to give a Christmas lecture at the Royal Institute in London in 185 years. So that's a really good breakthrough. He's a keen athlete, a family man, and of course, he looks younger than his age.
I feel older than my age. Does that balance things out, Roy?
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's taken a little bit. It's taken a minute, hasn't it? I think with COVID and job changes and general life busyness. But yeah, no, it's absolute pleasure to be joining you tonight.
It has, and it's a pleasure to have you. So I'll just jump right into it. Tell us something about you that we don't know.
Something about me that you don't know. So I grew up in the county of Derbyshire, so I was born in Derby. And one thing that is probably unknown about me is I spent a lot of my early childhood camping and caravanning, which I think for black people on the call will identify with this. There's not many black caravanners and campers, right? And it would be fair to say my mum was from Jamaica, my dad was from St. Vincent. Caravanning and camping in the outdoors was not a particular rich part of their childhood growing up in the Caribbean, right? So, but for reasons that have still never been made clear to me by my mum at least, they somehow got into caravanning and camping. So I spent a lot of time growing up being the only black person on a campsite or a caravan site, typically in Derbyshire or South Wales or some other place. So I think that's one bit of my background, which not many people know, but it does possibly explain at least slightly how I ended up becoming a geoscientist. Because I spent a lot of time kind of in harsh conditions, walking around in valleys next to rivers or walking across rivers with my parents. The other thing that nobody knows about me, I don't think, is that I'm actually quite a proficient knitter. So there you go. That's my other. That's two things you don't know about me, I think.
No, you can't just leave it there. How did you start knitting?
My mum taught me. She taught me. It was kind of curious. I think it's maybe a Caribbean mother. Like, you know, you're not going to get a free pass, so you need to do something in the house. So I'm really into cooking. I know how to iron clothes. I can use an iron. I never iron anything. Me and my wife never iron any of our own clothes or our kids' clothes. But let's just put that aside and say that I can iron. I also love cooking, and I think she just taught me a bunch of things that she was doing.
House skills.
And I think I was always quite nerdy and into things that my mum was doing, and so time spent with her was just spent doing, you know, what she was doing. So for some reason, I just picked up on doing that. So it's been quite nice to kind of pass that on to some degree to my children.
You better pass that on, because I think those are good house chores, and it's probably fading out, especially the knitting part. It's definitely fading out. So if you can keep it alive, that would really be good. So we're here to talk about academic leadership through an ethnic lens. And I think there's no best person to speak about this than yourself. Can you just tell us, before we jump into it, a bit about your academic career so far? How you started, how long you've been in, some of the activities that you've been privileged to run within the academic space.
Yeah. So I grew up in, like I said, in Derby. I come from not an academic family. My parents were both nurses, emigrated from the Caribbean, Jamaican St. Vincent, into the UK in the late 60s. So, you know, they came over to be nurses, and so there was no like academic heritage to my family background. I engaged in school to the required level demanded by a Caribbean parent pair. You know, you didn't have to be the best, you just had to leave school feeling you worked hard. So, you know, being polite, being attentive and working hard was something that was very important to my parents when I was growing up. And I went to school, you know, doing well academically overall. I was kind of maybe a bit distracted at times. I was very sporty through up to GCSEs as well. But I was always doing well academically, and I think I was always interested in school, not particularly any discipline by any stretch, which I'll come on to in a moment, but I was just interested in being in school and learning certain things and so on. My parents were just supportive generally. They weren't demanding of me academically, but they were supportive. They were demanding in terms of the effort I was putting into my work, but they weren't particularly pushy about where I might go with that. I did my GCSEs. I did well in my GCSEs, and then I went to a sixth form college, not a sixth form associated with a school, but a city college, because the sixth form block that my school went to, so I went to like an inner city state school, and the sixth form block burnt down. So that gives you a little window into the school I went to. It was called Noel Baker Community School, and it was one of the, and still is one of the lowest ranked by Ofsted secondary schools in the country. But you know, it was a very formative place for me to grow up, because people were, you know, largely white. 200 people in my year group, maybe 12 black kids in that year group out of 200, so we were in the minority. But people were generally quite nice, very working class school to go to. So not many people went to A-levels, right? Most people went off to go and do apprenticeships or things like that. So I kind of stumbled into A-levels. I stumbled into doing geology, geography and media studies, which people think is some kind of like basis for what I then went on to do. And it wasn't at all. The reason I went and did that was because I was just interested in photography and journalism and film and things like that. So it wasn't that I thought it would lead me anywhere. It was just that there were things that were enjoyable. And geography, likewise, it was just one of the subjects I found easiest to do at school. Geology was a bit of a random one. I like the physical bit of geography, you know, the world around us, and geology allowed me to go more into that. So there was never a big master plan when I chose my A-levels about where I was going to go. And that's kind of in contrast to a lot of people I then subsequently met at university, and people in the middle classes now, how they talk about selection of things like A-levels or degree programs. It's like with a much longer term view of where people are going to end up. So yeah, so I ended up doing those A-levels, did well in my A-levels. I didn't decide to go to university. This is another thing nobody knows about me, I guess, but it's relevant to this particular story. Is I didn't decide to go to university until into the second year of my A-levels, because I went to a city college where going to university wasn't necessarily a logical step after that. It was people doing BTECs or HNDs and going into apprenticeships. So I was wholly unaware, by virtue of the fact that not many people were going to university, and my parents hadn't gone, and none of my friendship groups, families had gone to university, what university was. So it was introduced to me by a careers advisor who said, well, what are you thinking of doing? And I was like, well, I don't really know. I might try and get an apprenticeship at Rolls-Royce or Toyota or one of the big businesses that operated around Derby. And then she was, oh, well, university's an option. And then she told me about nightclubs and going out and partying and a deep dive into a subject. And so I put in a UCAS application, and with the help of the careers advisors, eventually ended up going to Manchester to study geology, but it was all very lastminute.com, to be honest. And I think there was a bit of, I think there was some useful ignorance on my part and on my parents' part about what university was going to entail. And my parents, I would say, my dad's passed away now, but they were always quite comfortable in no matter which room they were in. So even though they were in these like very white rooms on the campsite, or at the at the social club where my dad was a nurse, there was a social club attached to it. There was not many black and brown faces there. They always seemed quite relaxed in there. So I kind of went into university and maybe even now to a degree, it's not being bullish or feeling you're entitled to be there, but I never saw them kind of intimidated. Subsequently to that, when I talked to my mum and when I spoke to my dad, they told me about horrific racial acts they were subjected to when they first arrived in the UK, but I never really saw them cowed by that when I was growing up. So I was always, thinking back now, I guess I've taken some inspiration from that. So going to university eventually to do geology, I had generally a good time there. So yeah, that was kind of getting to university, and then I don't know, my career is my career. Then went into industry for 3 years working for a company called having done a PhD. I went into industry for 3 years for a company called North Hydro, now Equinor. Worked as a exploration geologist based in Bergen in Western Norway, and then left there for various personal reasons to come to do a 1-year maternity cover at Imperial. And then 18 years later, I found myself still as an academic, having initially started that job for 1 year to cover maternity, wanting to go back into the private sector, but just eventually getting sort of trapped, if you will, in academia for 17, 18 years. And then I've just left and gone to Jacobs early this year. So my career has been a series of misfortunate events, I would say, that have been poorly planned, but have given me some really good opportunities and allowed me to meet some great people.
That's fascinating. I was about to say that must have been one very long labor for you to have covered 18 years.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. No, I mean, we might talk about this in a bit, but I've never been very strategic with my career, and that's probably quite clear from where I am now, having just been where I was. Because that academic career I had was never planned. I never wanted to become an academic, and I eventually fell into it because I left an industrial position. I was looking for another industrial position and couldn't find one, and somebody offered me a 1-year maternity cover, and I thought, well, it's better than being unemployed. And so I entered into it, and then I always describe it as the job sort of grew around me. I found myself in this position at Imperial, and the job grew around me in a kind of positive way. I started to learn new things. I started to learn that the things I'd learned in industry were relevant to academia. I started to meet some nice people. There were some interesting scientific projects to work on. And then I just found myself as an academic, and it was never through a part of a grand scheme. And, the history is as it is. I've recently left and gone back into industry, but yeah, it was, there were good times there at the start.
That's very fascinating, and thank you for giving us a snapshot of your life. I think one thing that echoes is the fact that I think you put in a lot of hard work wherever you found yourself, and I think that's what's paid off. Maybe less on the strategic side, but more on the hard work and focusing on whatever it is you found yourself doing. And certainly it's led you to become, I would say, almost an icon, because within the geology space, certainly you were very well known, you were very well recognized, and even beyond that. So yeah, so job well done to that. So if we come down to the topic, I would want you, based on your experience so far within academia, to sort of paint a picture of what the current leadership structure is today in academia.
So I think the leadership structure is probably as it is in most industrial things. It's very hierarchical, of course, right? There's accumulated power and accumulated privilege through promotion frameworks, right? So the more you do, the more you get, and the more autonomy you have. So I think that's common between academia and industry. So you have, there's little kingdoms of research groups, and then those research groups sit under a section head, and then those section heads sit under a head of department, and then there's faculties or schools or institutes, and eventually we go up to the kind of president of the university. So which would be the CEO equivalent in a company. Interestingly enough, I think the kind of introduction of fees in university 12 years ago, I mean, that system, that framework probably has always existed, but I think as universities have become more business-like in the time I was there, that structure has become more formalized, and then there's more budgetary allocations across that framework than maybe historically there was before. So there have been some changes. So in that sense, I think it's exactly the same as it is in industry. I think so in terms of leadership, I think for better or worse, that's what it's like. And I say for better or worse because I think having a system like that allows leaders at relatively low levels to have a disproportionate level of control on a number of people. So a research group leader can make life very difficult or very good for 6, 7, or 8 people sitting under them, with very little oversight coming down from above them to those 6 or 7 or 8 people working under them. Do you know what I mean? They can be quite firm boundaries, and people can very heavily run people's lives because it's quite a fragmented system. Academics love autonomy, right? They love the idea of freedom of inquiry, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, scientific freedom. And those are all, good things to a point, but it needs some joined up thinking in terms of leadership to make sure that people aren't suffering in corners because you've got all this stratification, all of these different levels of leadership. I think one way that it differs to industry is the way we're assessed, and the way that power and privilege are accumulated through promotions. Is, we have a number of different ways of assessing academics. So how many papers you write, how many grants you win, how many awards you win. These are all things which are seen to be measures of your acumen, measures of your importance, measures of your excellence and brilliance. And we should reward that by giving you a professorship title, or we'll give you more money, or we'll give you more lab space, and that allows you to become a bigger fish in that pond. In business, that might be how many tenders you win. That might be, so there are comparators. I would say where that's different in terms of the leadership aspect is that I think again, going back to my Equinor days and what I'm experiencing now, leaders are driving that team, and so it's almost a reward for the entire team, right? That the measure is of the team's performance, and that's partly a measure of the leader. I don't think academia has that to the same degree. I think oftentimes, even if a team has put together the work that underpins that paper, or over your 20-year career, your award for being the best scientist in the world is because you're brilliant. It's not because there's been 20 years worth of people working through your laboratory doing work, which means that your name has happened to be on a bunch of papers and so forth, and therefore you win this award. All those people, are kind of in your rearview mirror and are not recognized. So I think there's maybe the timescale at which those awards happen, the recognition happen, are different, and that means that sometimes the accumulation of effort by a team, and it is largely team-based, right? Let's not forget, whether it's academic or industrial. I think in academia we can sometimes lose sight of that, and we become fixated on, we call it the lone genius, right? We reward the lone genius, and so I think I do see that difference. I see that structure in leadership in academia, and I see that difference between that leadership structure and industry in that way.
So it's very interesting. You've mentioned a few things that I actually can relate to, but I want to come back to the fragmentation, well, if I may say, the fragments that exist within the academic structure. I've noticed that at a certain level, it can be a barrier for students. So let me paint a picture. I'm a student. I go through a PhD. I finish my PhD. I probably published 1-2 papers. I want to come back into the same system that I've just come out from, same university. However, there's a barrier for me to come back, either as a research scientist or or to come in even as a lecturer. For some universities, it might be easy to come in as a lecturer, but for most, it might be quite difficult because they would want to see some form of progression, and not just doing a PhD, but also doing that, being a research associate and all of that. And what I find is far too often, that fragment causes a barrier for people to come back, or for people of color especially, to come back into the system, because at that point in time, they feel that it's almost a clique that will be able to get or preference or will be preferred to come back into the system. And I've seen that happen personally in the university that I finished from.
Yeah, I think there's a thing called the hidden curriculum people talk about, right? There's a bunch of social norms, or there's a bunch of behaviors and things which, if you're not privy to those, you will look as like an outlier, right? So if you're outside of the in-group, you're going to be less attuned to what the in-group are talking about, how they operate, the secret handshakes almost. And yeah, the term we use, the phrase we use is the hidden curriculum. And I think if you're not, like you say, if you're not privy to that when you're trying to re-enter a space, it's almost impossible, right? I mean, it's hard enough if you've always been in that space to progress, because of these different barriers, and that could be racism, that could be misogyny, homophobia. There's a number of things which limit the progress of certain historically excluded groups. But then it's compounded if you're kind of coming newly into that, right? You're kind of moving back into that space and trying to learn those things for the first time. I mean, how do you do that? And unless people are acting as mentors to you and actively making you aware of those things, you're not gonna progress. The reason I hesitate when I talk about this sort of thing is because it really frustrates me, this idea that what we need to do is upskill all of these people who are deficient in social norms to get them to operate in this system which is oppressing them. What would be far better, of course, would be not to have these social norms, and would be for the people who are making the decisions and in power to be aware that there is this hidden curriculum, and that this candidate, let's say, who's sitting in front of them for this interview, let's say, might not be attuned to those things, and to actually refine their behavior and refine their language and refine the structure they're using to assess this person, to take into account that they have this different cultural background. And I don't mean that in terms of race and ethnicity, I just mean culture, that they've come from an industrial culture, right? So they irrespective of race and ethnicity. So it's absolutely true. Yeah, so I do kind of struggle when we're looking at these deficits in people and trying to fix them, rather than just throwing the system in the bin and starting again. But that's just because I just think.
So, and that's quite true. So you mentioned mentors. Are they lack of mentors and sponsors in academia, or at least the academic leadership?
I think so. I mean, I've been very fortunate with this, that the people. I mean, mentorship and sponsorship are two different things, right? Mentorship is more that one-on-one engagement, especially in personally, where sponsorship would be you don't even need to be in the room and somebody's advocating for you, right? You need both sponsors and mentors. And I've been fortunate that my mentors and sponsors have been good, and my mentors and sponsors, by virtue of the fact I've been a black geoscientist, have been white and white men typically, right? And I've been fortunate that they've been very, very, very good to me, and they help me advance my career in that way. So I think trying to use mentorship and sponsorship for black scientists, and in geosciences especially, ain't going to happen, because there's not enough, right, in certain parts of the world. Remember, there's plenty of black geoscientists in on the African continent.
Of course.
You know, we talk about it like, oh, there's just none anywhere. You know, there are parts of the world where there are non-white geoscientists, lots of them. I just don't think that's going to happen. So what do we need? We need to have visibility and have the black geoscientists we have being able to vocalize and be visible for those people. But equally, we need non-black geoscientists to be advocating for black people as well. So we need other people to be doing the labor. And I think over the last 2 years, we've had more of a conversation around this since the murder of George Floyd. You know, not just in geosciences, not just in academia, but in every corner of public life. And so that's been encouraging to see people educating themselves as to these barriers, which they've never experienced themselves, but they are increasingly now aware exist for this particular group of people. And there are people who are passionate about trying to remove those things and are actively engaged in that. So I think that's really good to see. But yeah, I've objectively kind of not faced those barriers if you look at my career progress, but probably behind closed doors, those absolutely have happened to me. There have been barriers put there. I've just fortunately not seen them, or it's not hindered my progress, or if I've actually seen them, I've just ignored them and just thought this is their problem, not mine. But that's just my personality.
Okay, so when you gave the Christmas lecture series, there was a lot of conversation that followed, a lot of people posting tweets that were unpleasant, and of course, majority of people who commented were very positive. How important do you think, or in your opinion, is it for Black scientists to start representing the scientific community, especially when we come to doing a lot of, for example, scientific lecture series or programs on TV, most especially? How important do you think that representation is?
I think the representation. Sorry, I'm just going to hide that. I think the representation is very important. I think the representation can take many forms. I mean, one thing is, you know, you just want to get the science right and make people think that, you know, you do know your science and they think you're a valid scientist, right? So just getting the nuts and bolts of the science is important. I think often as a Black scientist, when you're going into these very white spaces, the Royal Institution being one of these, but any sort of science communication sphere you can talk about would be the same. You know, they're very white spaces, and therefore, as a Black person, if you just put the science to one side, you just want white people to think that you're a polite, well-dressed, well-spoken Black person, and you're just like them, and you know, try and be as professional as possible, and have all the cultural. Yeah, you have the right profile to fit in that space. And I think there's always that lingering in the background that you don't want people to kind of undermine your expert credibility by the fact. But like, you know, putting that aside, you've just got to be you, right? You've got to be you. You've got to come with, you know, if you know, the way you dress, the way you wear your hair, the way you speak, you know, the language you have, you know, those things need to be authentic to you, because you can't, in that journey into these spaces where you're representing Black people, lose, I would say, your Blackness, right? Your history, your cultural background are part of that conversation. What this does, I think, is it takes you from a position of just talking about just the science to having a much broader discussion around race and ethnicity and identity, and how they have or do not have access to these scientific spaces, whether it's an academic institution or it's something like the Royal Institution Christmas Lectures. So when I was involved in that in particular, you know, the climate change and the geological record of climate change, sure, yeah, that's a topical thing. It's really important. We should absolutely be talking about that. And I'm going to tell you a bit about rocks and fossils and whatever else. But it was an opportunity to have a much bigger discussion, wasn't it, about like, oh, this guy is the first Black person for 182 years, I think it was at that point, to have given the Royal Institution Christmas Lectures. Is that part of the conversation? And, you know, I and others at the Royal Institution and some journalists as well thought that absolutely was part of the conversation, that, you know, we're not just going to talk about this particular topic that's going to be presented this year, we can have a much broader topic around a much broader discussion around the topic of why hasn't there been a black person giving this lecture? I would like to think that I fully engaged in that conversation, and I kind of put to one side the science and was like, yeah, the science is fine. And I made a comment at that when I was being interviewed and said, you know, don't kid yourself that in 185 years, there has not been another qualified black person to give this lecture. There absolutely has. There's nothing special about me. I am no smarter, and in fact, I am probably significantly less smart than a lot of black scientists who've come before. Now, let's have a conversation about why I'm the first then, in light of that. And that is because there has been racial bias, right? There's been prejudice against black people having access to those spaces and being considered credible and expert to go and give those talks. That's why, you know. And we happen to be in the year I gave it in 2020 in a position where there was a much broader set of conversations going on around identity and access to certain spaces and opportunities. And so, you know, my talk and my identity happened to be very opportune. Now, one thing I always find quite funny about this is that, you know, part of the criticism I attracted for the lectures and the Royal Institution got for inviting me to give one of those lectures was that it was virtue signaling, that, you know, they just went and found some random black guy off the street who didn't know anything about geology to give this lecture because they wanted to be seen as woke and all this sort of nonsense, right? I was approached about the Royal Institution Christmas lectures before George Floyd had been murdered, right? And so not because it was announced after, right? So they approached me in February or March and said, Chris, we're putting together this thing. Would you be interested? I said yes. And then there was all the behind the scenes stuff. And then it was announced sometime in August, I think, or July or August. And everybody's like, oh, right, this, you know, this black guy gets murdered, and then suddenly they find this black scientist to give this talk about climate change. But it actually was, you know, this was already a conversation that was going on in that particular institution, the Royal Institution. Or they were aware of this lack of diversity historically. They then, you know, cross-correlated that with the fact I'd done some science communication, and then I was given this opportunity. But you know, that confluence of circumstances had possibly never arisen before to allow that opportunity to happen, to be afforded to another black scientist, and it absolutely should have.
There's something you mentioned about the credibility of black scientists, and you know, I find that very laughable because there's something AFBE does when on the build up to Black History Month, we start posting inventions, innovations created by black people, and it's amazing the number of inventions and innovations that you find that was created or originated from black people. So yeah, talking about, you know, historically
hidden figures, right? It's like the hidden figures story. You know, these black women, physicists and engineers and mathematicians who made this incredibly substantial contribution to, you know, our efforts to go into space and land on the moon. And then it, you know, these stories are sort of hidden, and we can look at innumerable historically excluded groups and see within them these stories which have just been hidden from view because, you know, partly it's just because racism meant that those stories were stolen from those people, or misogyny or homophobia or transphobia meant those stories were stolen from them. The other thing is, you know, this ability to self-advocate and the channels through which you can now do that, including social media. You know, people weren't doing that. You know, it wasn't built into their psyche, or, you know, they weren't just given the opportunity to go out and self-advocate or have networks of people like your group or any sort of black network to say, okay, we're now chorus, right? We have a big enough group now that we can actually start to amplify the contributions of these people. And you know, we're in we're not in the best of times yet, but we are working towards building those networks and those awarenesses so those stories in the future aren't lost from view.
I'm going to turn to, I think we have 2 questions in the chat group. The first one is, can we bring, I think this was in response to when we were having a conversation around mentors or sponsors. It says, can we bring Black geoscientists and subject matter experts from business in as mentors on research projects to overcome the ethnic gaps in academic leadership?
I think so. I think there's I think anything that increases the visibility of Black leaders is good. So to inspire, how do I phrase this? To inspire a Black PhD student to aspire, to inspire them to go into a leadership position inside of the university or even outside of it, just seeing somebody Black in a leadership position is useful. It doesn't have to be the dean of the faculty, right? It could be the section chief for BOC, or it could be somebody else who's there, who is in a position where they're, well, it depends how you define leadership, which is an interesting thought. You want to see somebody who has been recognized for their professional contributions. They are inspiring and empowering people who work in a team with them, not under them, but with them. It's their job. That's what people need to see. And I don't think that needs to be in exactly the same sector, because I think we should be eloquent enough to talk across between academia and industry to find what are the common things that allow a leader to bring their staff with them and to maximize the kind of experience of the staff. And I don't want to say maximize the productivity or maximize the efficiency or maximize the dollar value of individuals, because then you just start, making people a number on a spreadsheet. I mean, how do you make people the best they can possibly be and make them want to come to work in the morning and do that? So for that question, absolutely, I think there shouldn't be any barriers between those two different sectors, because as my career has maybe shown, there is some porosity, some permeability, I should say, across that barrier, that people can take experiences from different domains and use them. Because I think there's some things that they do in industry a lot better in terms of leadership than in academia, quite frankly.
So you're quite right, and I think mentors in industry or in any other field can actually be drafted or brought into the academic system, because as a student, nothing inspires more than seeing people who have achieved in a certain area, who are able to have conversations with you to either help guide you or help distill your thoughts or help you to channel your energy and your thoughts in a certain direction, but ultimately inspire you to be more, to do more. So I think, yes, the answer is there should be more of that, getting leaders. And for the definition of leaders, a leader can be anybody who takes on that responsibility. It's people who care for others, because a leader is selfless and is willing to serve. So basically, it can be anybody who is willing to help out, who's willing to serve, who's willing to do this to help promote another individual or help promote somebody else within the academic system. Another question is, to what extent do you think that scientific racism, i.e. the myth of intellectual inferiority, is still prevalent? So, which brings us back to the same
I
topic.
think academia is awful for that. I mean, I've had some super painful conversations about this. So I'll give you one example without giving away too many names. My experiences at Manchester, which some of you may be aware of, in conversations related to that, I brought up in a meeting with somebody who was senior to me around racism occurring within academia and within the University of Manchester, and this white middle-aged man looked genuinely shocked, and he said, racism. I mean, it's not like there's racism in academia. It's not like there's racists working in academia. And I was just like, academia is a cross-section of all of the belief systems and identities in broader society. And you might wish to think that, it's just only full of white liberal progressives and open-minded, but they're not, And he was genuinely shocked at the notion that there were racists who were very clever. He thought like somehow race was tied to intelligence, and therefore all the working class people were racist and all the middle class and upper class people were obviously not. And we've just seen politically in the last few days, you know, we've got coming down the pipe a load of black and brown people who, in my view, have views which are not going to empower racial minorities in this country, but they are considered leaders, and they by some. And so yeah, I think there is absolutely an issue with this in academia, and I think it makes it harder to unpick because people think it doesn't exist, and they are ignorant to it, and they are ignorant willfully or deliberately to the fact that, you know, we have this term systemic racism, which describes the fact that we have a series of organizational structures which disproportionately negatively impact certain groups. Now, the problem with systemic racism, I think, is that almost nobody thinks they control it. We have this framework in the system, and we're all sort of operating around it. But actually, it's the people in power and privilege who can actually attune that system to remove those barriers, because they think it's not themselves, right? It's not me calling somebody a name in the street or physically assaulting somebody because they're black. Therefore,
I have a black friend.
I have a black friend. It's fine, you know. I listen to hip hop, and you know, I've got a hoodie, and you know, I like Bob Marley, right? So I'm all good. These people think, but it's actually that framework that they're working in is hugely problematic. So they need to go and challenge that as well. You know, they need to go and look at that framework and realize that simply not being racist isn't enough. Being anti-racist is what's needed, and being anti-racist means going to challenge that system. And I think that step to this question, I think that step is, for academics, the hardest thing to do, is because it takes time, it takes emotional energy, it takes an awareness, which is kind of personal awareness and emotional awareness, and some people just don't have that in spades to do that. Yeah.
So that takes me to the next question, which just fits nicely from Thane Campbell. Says, do we need research training to be more inclusive before it becomes more diverse? For example, looking at high levels of mental illness and PhD training, do we need new forms of research training that embrace your blackness, or both approaches together?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, Thane. I think what we probably, well, no, not probably, what we focus on, or historically focused on significantly with research training, is the nuts and bolts of science and how we do it. How do we make this SEM, scanning electron microscope, work? How do we do this particular piece of analysis on this piece of rock to work out what its physical properties are? You know, we're very attuned to getting people to do the actual research, and then we're very attuned to getting people skilled to communicate that research to some degree, whether it's a written paper or a presentation or a poster, right? So that's historically, I think, and certainly that's the training I have, that's what makes you a scientist, right? Doing the science and telling people about it in some forum. What's as important is being aware of the broader scientific ecosystem in which all of that occurs, right? So, you know, this scientific question has been set by who to answer what question for the benefit of which people. That's as important as how you do that science, I think. You know, thinking about how do you conduct yourself in a research group situation or setting so that everybody, regardless of their identity, is empowered to do the best science possible. Why is that important? Well, it's important because if science is going to be as, you know, and if it's going to be as important and deliver as much as it can to society as it should do, everybody, every scientist, regardless of their identity, needs to be doing the best science they can. And they can't do that if, you know, you raise mental health, if they are suffering from poor mental health because of discrimination, right? So I don't care if you're doing the best science possible. If you're limiting the opportunity of another to do the best science they can do, then we are collectively failing to benefit. And so, and it, you know, again, you know, there's a geoscientist thinking about, you know, geosciences in the future. Geosciences is going to be important for solving energy challenges. It's going to be important for solving geohazard threats around the world. It's going to be important for water supply in parts of the world we've never been to. with cultures we will maybe never interact with people who have completely different belief systems to us. So to make sure that the science we're doing in those three different areas, geohazards, energy, and water, work as well as they can in parts of the world where we've never been to, we need to understand how those people believe about things, how they behave, how will we embed that into their political systems, because they're different to ours. So we need cultural awareness to do that. So science is a much bigger, the scientific endeavor is a much broader set of things than simply pushing buttons on a machine and talking about it at a conference. It's about understanding much more generally the ecosystem in which it's happening.
That's interesting. One question that I will go to, I would ask before I go to the questions in the chat group is, do you think there is an increase in discontent in academia, especially amongst people of color or of minority scientists in academia?
I think there's, I mean, do I have numbers to back any of this up? No, but do I have like the fact that this has been talked about quite a lot on social media and with me personally? Yes. There's a bigger discontent, I think, with academia, regardless of race and ethnicity. I think there's significant challenges to being an academic which are rising, which haven't been there in the last few decades. You know, acquiring funding, academic freedom to do what you want to do. To, you know, there's issues around the marketization of higher education. It's becoming more business-like. I referred to this earlier on, meaning that even the simple act of teaching is now monetized. It's got a lot more red tape, a lot more administrative tasks, which make it more difficult to engage in. So I think that impacts everybody, regardless of identity. But then within that, of course, then you're adding that general sector-wide pressure to then the specific experiences of people of color, let's say. You know, the people who, you know, you're still experiencing racism and discrimination, as well as then experiencing this more sector-wide difficulty in obtaining funding, right? So you get a compounding effect there. So yeah, there's a lot of like hashtag leaving academia discussions going on in Nature and Science, in lots of magazines. You know, every day if you go on social media, there's people talking about it. So yeah, and I you know, I've left, right? So I made my choice. I felt it. I felt it. I experienced it. I didn't like what I was experiencing. I didn't like what I saw was coming down the pipe. Therefore, I left. So I absolutely have my experience I can talk to. I just wasn't enjoying it as much as I was before, and luckily I was afforded an opportunity to go into a job with a company who were going to give me opportunity to do what I really wanted to do, which was science and DEI related work.
That's interesting. Thank you for that. So you've published a lot of papers, quite a lot of scientific papers in different journals. A question has been raised in the chat group where the BBC reported on Robert Mukaya in March, who is, you know, the UK's only Black chemistry professor. The report said that his applications for research grants to the country's main funding body have all been turned down. First of all, I almost fail to understand, you know, why someone who is a scientific researcher or a scientist would have applied countless times for funding to a research body and has been denied constantly. You know, have you ever faced issues like that, and how do you address it?
Yeah, I mean, I think obtaining funding is very difficult anyway in certain areas. You know, there's like 10% success rates and so on. So, you know, 1 in 10 is going to get funded. So if you play that out over a career, that means you're probably going to get like 4 research grants funded, and then you'd be batting at the average. So I think it's kind of sector-wide. Some people do much better than that, and there's nepotism and various other problematic reasons, I think, why people, and favoritism as to why people do better than others. I never personally was subjected to that so much, mainly because a lot of my funding came through industry rather than through governmental funding sources. So I was able to utilize contacts within industry to do research which was much more applied to specific industry problems, which meant that the success rate, if you will, was kind of higher because they weren't open calls for funding, generally speaking. They were much more ad hoc funding applications, and you were able to build and sustain a relationship with a funder. I mean, there was more expectation at the back end that the research that you were doing was highly relevant to that funder, because some company doesn't want a bunch of like things they can't apply to the problems they're trying to tackle, right? So there was quite a lot of demand in that respect from the funders, from the industrial funders. But yeah, it is very difficult. I mean, this has been looked at. Robert McCoy, there's Royal Society, there's Natural Environmental Research Council, NERC, EPSRC. A lot of funding bodies recently have been declaring rather slowly their funding rates for different race and ethnic groups, and you can imagine it's as horrible as you could imagine it would be. Black people do very badly out of this. So they need to do things to tackle this, and they're trying to put things in place. They're trying to diversify the calls, so the specific research funding calls to tackle specific funding, specific issues which are of high relevance to race and ethnic minorities. They're trying to diversify the scientific panels who assess these grant applications, because they're I won't say there is racial bias, no doubt, at play in how those proposals are being assessed. So they're trying to diversify that. They're trying to diversify the committees who work around those panels as well. They're trying to encourage more submissions from racial and ethnic minority groups to the different funding calls. So there are things, I would say, which I've seen in the last 2 years, definitely, maybe 3 or 4 years, where that has become much more part of the conversation. I think before those 2, 3, 4 years, we were already having much more of a conversation about gender disparities in funding. So we had, men, women, this is the differential, but then there's a, race and ethnicity sort of cut across those two things. Then when you start to segregate out those different groups, you suddenly realize, in particular, Black women do very poorly out of these funding calls, because they have the fact they're Black and there's racial discrimination at play, and the fact they're women and there's a degree of sexism at play as well, and misogyny at play in the funding. So so I think it's just generally good, Roy, that we're having more conversations about these things in forums like this, but also with funding bodies, with the government as well, in the companies like I work with at Jacobs. And we're empowering people to speak up about it, because I think 10 years ago, it just never happened, where I was less aware, and I just never saw those things happening.
Indeed, you're very right. I think now is the time to start having these conversations. Now is the time to increase, or at least be able to set some milestones that can be achieved, especially when it comes to discrimination and prejudice. We need to start changing the system, or at least we need to start influencing the system to be more accommodating and more accepting of others and people's differences. I think it's a very important topic. The last question I'll go to before we round up from Sydney says, I stumbled onto a research sometime that white STEM academics are more than 3 times more likely to become professors than their Black colleagues. Do you think this is why we still have few Black scientists in the UK? I think also the passage through the university hierarchy is not a great story for Blacks.
Yeah, a simple answer is yes. Depending on different studies in different countries as well, because there are countrywide variations in this. There's more white professors than Black professors, and more likely to be promoted to professorial level if you're white than Black. So there is that at play, and then it obviously has a kind of negative, if you will, trickle down effect, because then you don't have those people in positions of power to then, and visibility to inspire others. I think the other thing that's really important, I'm not sure I asked the question there, but I think one thing that's really important is that, and something which I've tried to do, and I don't know how successful I've been, is, there's a lot of jeopardy if you're Black at speaking out, right? So you can speak out and then you could be subjected to increasing levels of hostility and racism if you speak out. And therefore, the question you have to ask yourself is, am I willing to jeopardize what I do have in the pursuit of more for myself or for others, right? And you have to work your way around that. Certainly when you get to more senior positions, I think then with that privilege and with that protection, it becomes easier to speak out, and not only are you more equipped of the challenges having confronted them and hopefully overcome them, but then you can have the protection to speak out and challenge white leaders, let's say, about the system, about their own individual behaviors, about their own prejudices, and try and push on that. As it is, we've seen Black and, let's just say more broadly, racial ethnic minorities who've done what we would call pulling up the drawbridge, right? They ascend into positions of power, and then through that journey, they become giddy with power, and they've assumed enough kind of norms that they kind of forget that they have struggled and they have overcome these barriers, and they do nothing to help others, and that's absolutely something we've seen politically in the UK, and we're probably about to see it happening politically in the UK soon with the recent announcements of the cabinet, where you kind of think, how can somebody have this view when they are themselves either immigrants to this country or they've come through this, and then suddenly they're like hostile towards these people and saying it doesn't exist. People just have short memories, right?
Indeed.
So I think it's really important to make sure that when people do get into those positions, it's not enough. It's not enough to ascend into those positions to the questioner. It's not enough to get into those positions. It's then a case of them being, I think, as much as you can afford to be, quite rambunctious and quite vocal and visible.
Yeah. Talking about jeopardy, I think it's applicable not just in academia, but also in the industry. Certainly you find people are scared. People will tell you they don't want to ruffle any feathers, or they don't want to stir the waters, or they don't want to point the floodlights or the flashlights on themselves when they speak up. And so people just tend to want to be invisible, especially when it comes to, this sort of conversation that we're having. And it's quite frustrating because you can see more that can be done by ourselves with our various groups that we belong to. But ultimately, there's always that barrier where people just are scared. I think it's. I
completely get it as well. It's why whenever I talk about these sorts of things, either in a leadership context like we're talking about it now, or anything to do with my sort of what I've done in my career, is it's also very strongly personality dependent, of course, right? If I was a different person, I'm sure I wouldn't be where I am now, right? Because I think there's a number of things which have happened to me that, either through ignorance or just being quite vocal or being quite committed or being quite empowered by people, or fortunate the fact I'm a man, not a woman, which have allowed me to take those things on. But these same experiences would have just completely, destroyed someone else, right? And I think that's the thing I think is important to take away from this. It's not a case of like fixing individuals and fixing people to get them to be more vocal and more argumentative or more, whatever it is. I think we need to work from the other way around. We need to go to the system and the leaders and get those things to change that way, so we don't have to go in and like one-on-one manipulate people's character and personality, because we are who we are, and we need to have systems and leadership which are much better attuned to bringing forward and bringing through all of those different people.
Indeed. We've come to the end. Before we close, just give us an advice. What advice would you give to an individual who is facing some form of racism, either at the career level or academic level? What kind of advice would you give to them?
I think the only advice, the immediate advice I'd give to them is try and find your people, right? Try and find your network and try and find trusted confidants. And those people don't have to be Black. I mean, if they are, then they will possibly have had a shared lived experience as you have and be able to identify, but just find people you can trust who can support you and advise you and listen. Sometimes just listening is all you need. It's not even advice you really need. I think that's the first thing. And through that act, you might then become sufficiently organized in your thoughts and aware of a procedure, or feel that what you experienced wasn't imagined, it was real, and it is an absolute microaggression. And you might then feel empowered to then go and take it through a formal reporting procedure, or get that person to go and challenge this other person about it. But I think one of the problems with racism is you can feel very alone in it, right? You can feel that it's because of you, and it is because of you, it's because you're black, right? So somebody does something horrible to you. But it's an experience that's lived through by many, and it's an experience that's witnessed by quite a few people. And it's also something increasingly, I think, non-black people, in terms of anti-black racism, are beginning to identify exists. And so there are white allies out there who can equally, I have, who are sensitive enough to have these discussions with and seek counsel with. So that would be my thing, is seeking counsel with trusted minds.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Professor Chris. I think that's a very good advice given to us. Take counsel in trusted friends and allies. On this note, we end the AFB Leadership Talk program. It's a pleasure having you, Chris. Thank you for coming. Next month, we'll be hosting the most senior Black female in Microsoft in the UK. So let's look forward to that. Flyers will go out next week, and hear more about the upcoming talks. Again, if you want to know more about AFBE and what we do, please, on the chat group, we've posted our websites and some of the programs, and a YouTube channel where we record all these videos, and it will be accessible on YouTube. So this video will also be accessible on YouTube in the next coming weeks. Thank you to everyone who's listened. I hope you have gained something from it. And we look forward to seeing all the spectacular things that Chris is going to be doing in his newfound company in Jacobs. I see one of your directors, Tendai, who's also a mentor, supported the Transcend program.
Tendai's keeping an eye on me.
I see he's joined the as one of the listeners. So it's very good to have supportive people and have a company that is supportive of these kind of conversations. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to everyone who's been able to attend. Look forward to seeing you in our next leadership talk. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Chris.